another explanation of the mitzvah of tzitzit, not so much the mitzvah itself, but the wording and its specific placement in the Torah reading, is that it's actually a direct response to something that happens at the beginning of the Torah portion, which Ron mentioned, which is the episode of the spies, right? These Israelites, they're in the wilderness, their mission, should they choose to accept it, that they have believed that they've been on, has been walking toward the promised land, and they're supposed to go in, and they don't know what it's like. And so God says to Moses, and Moses says to them, you should send in some spies to go see who's there and, bring back a report so we know what we're getting into. And so God spoke to Moses, saying, Shalach lecha anashim, vayeturu et haaretz. Send in guys, vayeturu et haaretz. And so the word vayeturu, in this context, means to look around, to assess, to gather information, to use the faculties of your five senses, to bring back a report about what is there, okay? And what happens, this isn't the part that we read, but I'll just tell you, what happens is they do come back with a report that describes what they saw, but it also interprets what they saw. So it describes people that are huge and grapes that are huge and people that are going to devour us. And they say, we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, but we must have looked that way to them too. This land will swallow us up. And their fear becomes this contagion that spreads throughout the camp. And everybody starts freaking out and saying, we don't want to go anymore. And so Moses and Aaron are devastated because, of course, they've been leading the group with the entire purpose of having this be their destination. And now the people, I don't want to go anymore. It's like your kids getting, 20 minutes from Disneyland and then like, I don't want to go anymore. Like, what? We got you this far. You are going. And God says, yeah, forget it. You're not going. Like, I thought I could trust you, this generation who saw slavery and the splitting of the sea. And I showed this place to you with the hopes that you would want to go there. But instead, you're afraid and you're being driven by fear. And the Midrash actually says, God looks at them and responds to their exclamation, we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves. God says, it's understandable that you looked like grasshoppers to yourselves. Dr. Aviva Zornberg says, all of us start out life as small, defenseless little creatures. It's understandable that we feel small sometimes in the face of, greater enemies, or we think the world's gonna eat us, like the great fear of, any little tiny thing. But the sin, the problem, was assuming they knew what the other people were thinking. God says, what do you know? What do you know about what they're thinking? You can't assume anything about them just based on your insecurities. God says, I can't trust your analysis of what you saw. And if you're gonna live by fear, you will die by fear as well. And this is the end of the generation that left Egypt. They are going to die in the wilderness. But relevantly, there are two people who are spared this fate of dying in the desert, and they are Yehoshua and Caleb and Joshua. And they're spared this fate because they saw the exact same thing. They saw the big grapes, and they saw the big people, and they saw, the same land. And they said, yeah, guys, it looks daunting, but we can do it. We can do it. Let's embrace our future with open arms. And their faith and optimism is rewarded by getting to be the guys who lead the children of this generation into the land 40 years later. Now, what does this have to do with tzitzit? So in the verses Ron read so beautifully, maybe you heard this word either when we davened it in the service or when Ron read it in the text. In a very different context, at the end, in that last paragraph, we read, Velo taturu acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem. Right? That sound a little familiar? Lo taturu. And you will wear these tzitzit, and you will look at them, and you will be reminded of my commandments, and you will not stray after your eyes or the lustful urges of your heart. And so now this word latur, lo taturu, has lost its kind of non-judgmental observational quality and means this is something your eyes, your heart, you could be distracted from where you should be going. You could be distracted from the important moral and spiritual growth that this tradition and these tzitzit are supposed to embody and remind you of. And these tzitzit are therefore supposed to be a kind of inoculation against the temptation of following your eyes or your lustful urges of your heart, which are described in that word latur. Velo taturu. Don't be seduced by your eyes and heart. They will lie to you. They will lie to you. And so the original spies, as we know, were like lured by their eyes into this kind of self-obsessed fear of the unknown and their lack of control in this big bad world. It was a story they were telling themselves. And so this next generation with the mitzvah of tzitzit are being told, don't believe everything you see. Don't believe everything you feel. You have a partial view, so it means your feelings are yours, and they're real, but they're not everything, and they're not the whole truth, right? You have a partial view, and so do your fellow travelers, and together, in dialogue, you'll have a bigger, more complex, and more complete picture. And so even when we think we're being objective observers, you know, scouting out the land, so to speak, latur, a lot of what we see, and we now know this from social science, is preconditioned by our previous life experience, right? Our insecurities, our fears, our emotions. We create whole stories in our head that are necessarily partial and reflect our limited life experience when we look at the world, right? The saying goes, we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. Heard that before? Right? So therefore, lo taturu acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem. Don't be seduced or deceived by your eyes. And this made me think, how many times do we have conversations about stuff that we can see, you know, beyond us? Let's say politics, thorny topics, and we think to ourselves, if only they could see what I see, if only they had the information I have, they would come to the conclusions I have arrived at, right? They'd see it differently. Maybe some of you are familiar with Jonathan Haidt's seminal work, The Righteous Mind, where this is what he takes on, exactly this question. Given the same evidence in front of us, how is it that people come to such different conclusions? And the presumption is everybody's a decent person. So it's how is it that good, decent people come to such wildly different conclusions based on the same information in front of you? Is it because half the country is stupid, backward-thinking sheeple who don't know any better than to think they're stupid, wrong thoughts? And if they only had better information, they would agree with me, right? Well, if each half thinks that about the other, then we're either all wrong, stupid sheeple thinking wrong, dumb thoughts, or none of us are, and we all could do with a little more perspective and humility, right? For anybody with both liberals and conservatives and Trump supporters in the family, for anyone with Zionists and anti-Zionists or J Street people and AIPAC people in the family, we know that when looking at the very same information, we can come to different conclusions. And that's not because we're wrong, bad, terrible people, or the people in our family or the people we love are. It's because there's more than meets the eye, clearly. So Jonathan Haidt begins by reminding us that as rational as we think we are, you know, latur, like, you know, as non-judgmental observational observers as we may think we are, that we're primarily emotional creatures. We imagine that our brain is like an elephant driver that can point the elephant of our consciousness wherever we want it to go. We think our brain, that rider, that driver, is smart and rational, and we base our opinions on evidence, and we argue our case like a scientist, dispassionately. That's how we imagine that we function. I love that we have experiential educators in the room, because you know that the way that learning really happens is not through the head, but through the heart, through our life experience. So the truth of the matter is, of course, our heart, our emotions, our fears, our traumas, our loves, our religious commitments, our family of origin, our stories, all of that is the elephant. All of that is the elephant. And what the rider does when we find ourselves in one of those thorny conversations. What the writer does is hold on for dear life and construct the story that justifies the reactions we're already having. That's what the social science tells us. It makes our reactions make sense. So what he says is, rather than imagining that our mind is a logic processor, he says our mind is a story processor. We create the stories that undergird the conclusions we've already drawn on an emotional level. And if you want to change somebody's mind, therefore, you don't give them new evidence. If they could only see what I see, no, you talk to their elephant, or rather, you listen to their elephant. Got to really listen to somebody's elephant if you hope for them to see what you see. So I was supposed to spend this summer, actually next Sunday, I was supposed to fly off to Israel for year 2 of a 3-year learning program I'm in, the Rabbinic Learning Intensive, that I feel so grateful and lucky to be part of. It's this program that gets me out of my familiar surroundings here in Chicago and takes me to one of the most beautiful and holy and fractured cities in the world, Jerusalem, for 5 weeks of learning. I do 3.5 in the summer and 1.5 in the winter. And I've spent the past 2 summers having deep, hard conversations with colleagues and scholars in dialogue with texts and in dialogue with, just what's happening in the world across the spectrum of political commitments and denominations. And it's a real gift to get to do this, And of course, this summer's RLI and all of Hartman's summer programs were canceled. And I saw Lisa here a moment ago, and we're all bummed. We're all bummed about it, as much as we, of course, understand that the learning experience that we were signing up for was not necessarily to, experience the everyday life of people running to bomb shelters every time a ballistic missile is lobbed, in your city, for the people who have bomb shelters at all. So in any case, the reason why they subsidize all these rabbis like me doing this program is because they hope that I'll bring some of the learning back and share it with you, which I try to do in ways big and small. I wanted to just offer one little thing that's part of a curriculum they have called the I Engage curriculum, and it is designed for the explicit purpose of helping communities have conversations about thorny topics, but specifically about Israel. Right? If this once upon a time was a very unifying subject in the Jewish community, it has lost that unifying quality, and it is now one of the most polarizing. And it's one of those kinds of conversations about which people tend to think, well, if they saw what I saw, they'd think what I think. It brings out all of our best, I feel, when that's a joke. It really, especially, it's so personal for those of us that do this for a living, whose professional lives are also, it's not just personal, it's professional, and it can be hard. It can be hard to have these kinds of conversations that appear to be about one thing, appear to be about the evidence, but are actually about all of our competing elephants. And so at Hartman, kind of basing this off of Jonathan Haidt's work, they came up with 6 values that are at play in conversations, at least within the Jewish community that they've identified, are these great elephants. And I wonder if you might want to take a guess about what these values are. So basically, in Jonathan Haidt's work, he identifies what he calls moral foundations. And he says all of us have moral foundations. If I say, which side, liberals or conservative, cares about family values, well, probably you'd say, oh, well, conservatives care about family values. But I'm sorry, I'm a liberal who has a family, and I care about my family, and I care about family values. What are you talking about? The point is all of these different moral foundations are weighted differently and mean different things to different people. And so Hartman came up with 6 different, they're not exactly moral foundations, but 6 different values that tend to drive people in conversation beneath the surface, even if it's not what you appear to be talking about. You want to guess what they are? Or one of them. Just guess one. I'm sure somebody else will have a different one. Ooh, respect. Very interesting. Justice. Say it again. Fair? Oh, fear. Fear. Okay. But would you call that a value? No. But it's true. Well, but here, I'll come back to that. Safety. Pikuach nefesh, saving a life. What else? What did you say in the back? Oh, giving, like generosity? Ah, fascinating. All right. So, yeah? Any others? Love. Ooh. All right. So, look, they're not saying these are the be all and end all, but these cover what I'm about to share with you, cover a large swath, I think, of what you said, and also here are a few things you didn't say. So one is self-preservation. You know, just underneath, and I think that's where fear comes in, self-preservation. Last night when I had this conversation with the folks online, somebody said survival. You know? And so the point is you're going to be willing to sublimate others of these values to the value that's on top, okay? So one is survival. Another one is peace. Like you'd sublimate other values to make peace. Justice. Compromise. Land. Right? Like the holiness of land, the sanctity of land. Jewish exceptionalism. Yeah, so I'll explain. Like, Eitan's like, what does that mean? Good, I'll say a little more about that in a second. Yeah, so those are the 6. Land, self-preservation, peace, justice, Jewish exceptionalism, and compromise. And so when I say these tend to drive Jewish people in conversations, my first reaction was like, yeah, but often we're in conversations with people who aren't Jewish. And it was like, yeah, we designed this stuff for synagogues. Like, we got to start with our own community. So I think what's important about these is they don't come with policy outcomes. These different values are not attached necessarily to policy outcomes. If you hold peace as a value above all else, you might believe that a two-state solution is the only road to peace in which two peoples have freedom and self-determination, and you might believe that will never lead to peace, and the only solution is a one state where everybody has the same rights as everybody else. And I've heard both, you know, in the Jewish community. You may hold self-preservation as a top value. And that may lead you to the conclusion that military means are always the best ways to solve problems, or tend to be if you find yourself in a military conflagration. Or that may mean that you tend toward diplomatic, how can we solve this without military? Both being self-preservation as your top value. Jewish exceptionalism, this is an interesting one. It can refer to how Jews throughout history tend to be blamed and persecuted, no matter where they go, for whatever thing may be plaguing a country. And that sense of, and that story of oppression, displacement as the backdrop to our childhoods, whether you have grandparents like mine who were Holocaust refugees, or your family fled the former Soviet Union, or any number of ways that Jews have been relocated and displaced, generally not by our own choosing, over the course of history. So against that backdrop, Israel can represent a great homecoming of promise and self-determination, and not being tossed around by the whims of dictators and illiberal governments when things start to go south. And Jewish exceptionalism may mean to you that it's not fair, but Jews are constantly under added scrutiny for whatever we do, and therefore having a state where we have to do such mundane things as have an army and protect borders and collect taxes and, you know, have a justice system and conscript soldiers and do PR in the age of social media, let alone have civic responsibilities for taking care of not only Jews, but also non-Jews. And importantly, the people who were here in this same land when this state was created and didn't then and still don't live with equal rights. You might think to yourself, that's not worth it, given that we will always be seen as the bad guy, right, in that calculus. So just to say these different values can lead us in different directions. Justice can look like a lot of things. Compromise can look like a lot of things. For the folks who privilege the value of land above all else, this is actually one that I find really like deeply divergent. Like we see in the Torah the value and connection to the land of Israel. And for the people who are motivated by land above all else right now, are sublimating others among these legitimate Jewish values in ways that I find terrifying and that are hurting lots of people in the name of a value that we saw in the Torah today. We got a lot of elephants. We got a lot of elephants. This week, my pastoral and rabbinic and social media and professional world was dominated by different elephants, right? Legitimate concerns, all stemming from legitimate Jewish priorities that just put these different values in a different order. And we arrive at different conclusions as a result. So here in this room and across the Jewish world, people continue to wear the hostage pins because there remain, right, probably 21 live and another 29 deceased hostages in Gaza. And they wear the pins because it's like we don't want the world to forget that that's happening. That is real. That is happening. These people are languishing. And whether wearing that pin is an indictment on Hamas or the Israeli government or the United States or all of them, the idea is in wearing this thing, I want people to see this issue. And maybe your heart will break and maybe something will change. This week, I visited with 6 young Jewish people who are doing a hunger strike for Gazans who are going through massive starvation across the Gaza Strip because they want to bring visibility to hungry people. And that, as Jews, is what they want to do, to bring our attention, to make our collective heart break so that something will change, because it feels like the Jewish thing to do, to care about hungry people. I think about, right, obviously the lens of the news cycle has shifted to Iran, and for many in the Jewish community, that's now where the viewfinder has shifted to. Let's all see that. And obviously, even in seeing that, it means that we're going to see different things and draw different conclusions. For some people I've spoken to, it's anti-Semitism here in the United States. That's the thing we should all be focusing on in the Jewish community. That's the thing we should be fighting. And then, for quite a lot of us, and maybe you, all of that seems, yes, it's true, it's happening. And closer to home, the Supreme Court just decided that trans kids and families who decide with their doctors to pursue medical care that can help them be healthy and happy is illegal in half the states in this country. Or, as a budget that may pass soon will do, will lock us into trillions of dollars of debt at the expense of the most vulnerable and voiceless in our society, including the environment. For me, that's the voiceless player in this conversation that I find myself looking at and concerned about. If you want to talk about crimes against unborn children, I want to talk about how ignoring climate change, what it's going to do to the lives of my children's unborn children, you know? So I'm not here to say that any one of these priorities is more or less important than another, because at the end of the day, our hearts are going to be drawn toward what our hearts are drawn to. Our elephants, based off of our life experience, the ways that the world has shaped us, we're going to be moved to care about the things that we care about in the way that we do, and it all matters. But rather, the Israelites in our Parsha, one of their great sins was that it could not see beyond the way that their myopic view limited their scope of options. They could only see what they saw in the way that they saw it, and they therefore believed there was nothing they could do. We should just turn around and go back to Egypt. It's kind of a stunning example of both insecurity and hubris, because they were unwilling to consider there might be another way. There might be other ways. But in order to get to those other ways that we haven't thought of or haven't gotten to yet, that means we have to talk to people who see it differently in our own community and beyond our own community. We have to, because the alternative is dying in the wilderness. That's what this week's Torah portion shows us. And so I believe our only future is one in which we take these tzitzit very seriously, whether or not we wear them, as a reminder that we can't trust our own eyes alone. It's not that we can't trust our own eyes. Of course we can, but we can't trust them alone. We absolutely have to be in dialogue with and open to and listening to and working with and imagining across lines of real difference if we will imagine making it to whatever the promised land might be. And I sincerely hope that we can. I believe that we can. So, Shabbat Shalom.